From 1947 to 1958, Robert Heinlein published a book every year through Scribners called the Heinlein Juveniles. They were aimed at teen boys. Some were even serialized in the Boy Scouts magazine. He also wrote what I consider another of his juveniles in 1963, Podkayne of Mars. Though that wasn't published through Scribners, so not officially part of the juvenile collection, Podkayne reads like the juveniles. But the main character was a teen girl rather than a teen boy, so I include it as one of Heinlein Juveniles. I do not include Starship Troopers, which was meant to be a juvenile, but rejected by Scribners and published for adults. Starship Troopers could be its own video essay, honestly. Altogether, we are covering a total of 13 Heinlein Juveniles. Over the past couple of years, I've been slowly making my way through reading them all, because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective investigating all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So I want to briefly go through each of the juveniles by publication date, give a star rating, and then at the end, rank them from what I consider to be top to bottom. Keep in mind the Heinlein Juveniles were published before middle grade and young adult were publishing categories. I think technically they're young adults since the protagonists are usually between 15 and 18, though I read them in middle school. And I know many people have found them before they were 13 years old, which is the cutoff date for middle grade. I also credit the Heinlein Juveniles as partly responsible for my love of science fiction. Now, I didn't read all of these books as a kid, just what I could find in the school library, and there were maybe 5 or 6 of them. And even those I did read, I didn't remember that much. So it was like discovering these stories all over again. Oh, and there will be spoilers. So now that you are warned, let's go ahead and jump in. In 1947, the first juvenile and the first novel Heinlein published was Rocket Ship Galileo. I actually put off reading this one because I wasn't drawn to the storyline about 3 teen boys building a rocket ship to the moon. Like a lot of the juveniles, Heinlein wanted to teach the target reader, i.e. teen boys, something about math or physics or engineering. So there were a lot of long scenes that went into detail about building the Galileo, a nuclear-powered rocket ship. Nuclear power. I hear your eyebrows raising. The 4th member of the team was an uncle of one of the boys who was a nuclear physicist and somehow could legally get fissionable material. What I thought was fascinating was he used thorium in the reactor instead of uranium because thorium was never developed in reactors. Thorium reactors would theoretically be much safer insofar as there's no possibility of a nuclear meltdown like what happened in Chernobyl. I'm not saying there's still not problems. They still produce radioactive waste, which is no small thing, but thorium reactors would definitely be more stable than the uranium reactors that were built. So why weren't thorium reactors ever developed? Well, they do not produce the type of plutonium needed for atomic bombs. So draw your own conclusions. Anyway, from the 21st century perspective, some of the science just seems wrong, starting with the cavalier way they treat radiation. For example, they build a rocket on a nuclear test site, even though there's lip service paid to wearing gloves and whatnot to reduce radiation exposure. At least I was cringing on how they were handling their nuclear tech. To be fair, this was 1947, and nuclear power was a very new technology, and a lot of people, like Heinlein, obviously, were very excited about its possibilities. Also, for some reason, Heinlein thought that acceleration of rockets would produce artificial gravity. Also, he said space wasn't cold, that was a myth, so they didn't need to heat their spacesuits. Keep in mind, this was written before the first person went into orbit. Heck, it was written before Sputnik. So, anyway, putting that to the side, I just wasn't engaged with the story. They spent most of it building their rocket ship, and then, yes, eventually they make it into space and land on the moon. Now, the twist here, and Heinlein loved to throw in a twist, the twist was there were Nazis on the moon. So the three teen boys and their uncle have to defeat the Nazis and save the Earth from yet another world war. Let me say again, this was written in 1947, and everyone had Nazis on the brain. But even so, I didn't care for the book, and I gave it 2 stars. By the way, this is the lowest rating I gave any of the juveniles. Next up is Space Cadet, published in 1948. This was the prototype to the Horatio Alger pull yourself up from your bootstraps story that was in many of Heinlein's juveniles, a coming-of-age story that sometimes is called a Bildungsroman. It's a real word. Look it up. Anyway, it tells the story of Matt Dodson, a boy from the Midwest who has been accepted into the Space Cadet Academy. Notably, the students and staff are multiracial, which we see again and again in the juveniles. Eventually, Matt and his buddies get assigned to a ship which travels around the solar system. The kids get into trouble you'd expect from teenagers, like drinking too much. But then, twist, they crash land on Venus and spend maybe the last third of the book making contact with the Matriarchal Society of Venusians and convincing them to help. I think some modern Western readers may get bored because there doesn't feel like a lot of plot until they crash land on Venus. I say Western because the plot structure feels a lot like the Asian plot format that's called the Kishi Ten Ketsu in Japanese, often called a story without conflict, where basically events move along without any suspense until the twist when things go in an unexpected direction. Modern Western plots that we're used to mostly start with a conflict set up in Act 1 or the first 20 or 25% of the story, and that drives the action forward. I seriously doubt Heinlein did this on purpose. I'd be shocked if he ever heard the term Kishi Tenketsu, but I think it's interesting enough to give Space Cadet 3 stars. Oh, if you didn't know, it inspired the Space Cadet television series in the 50s.
Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. Space Academy, USA, in the world beyond tomorrow, 2350 AD.
In 1949, Heinlein published Red Planet, the story of a teenage boy named Jim Marlowe and his best friend Frank Sutton, who are colonists on Mars. This is the first Heinlein story that features Martians, who we see again and again in later books. Heinlein was one of the first authors to world build a universe that is connected throughout many of his books, in this case called the Future History. If you've read Stranger in a Strange Land, you'll recognize the mystical Martians that share their planet with the human settlers. Jim has a pet named Willis, a native Mars species that looks like a bouncing volleyball that he takes to boarding school. But the evil school headmaster wants to steal Willis and sell him to a zoo. And the boys have to take action. And in doing so, they discover a sinister plot by the government and have to warn the other colonists, and they all rise up in revolt. Oh, and we discover that Willis is actually the baby form of the much larger and powerful Martians. It's really a fun story, which was one of my favorite reads in middle school, and I give it 4 stars. Then we have Farmer in the Sky, published in 1950, which also won a Retro Hugo for Best Novel. I think this is a terrible title. Who gets excited about a story about a farmer? But that disguises a really interesting story about a farming colony on Ganymede, one of Jupiter's moons. One of the latest families to emigrate to Ganymede is the Lermer family, made up of a man and a woman who recently got married, but each have a child from a previous marriage. Sort of an unusual family dynamic for the 50s. The father has a son, Bill, who is our story's protagonist, and his stepsister is a little girl named Peggy. We start as the family emigrates from Earth on a spaceship. Oh, hey, there are Boy Scouts on the spaceship. And yes, this was one of the serialized stories in the Boy Scout magazine. There are life-threatening dangers on the flight over, and when they get to the planet, life is rough. So rough, in fact, that one of the most surprising events in any Heinlein novel takes place. Bill's little stepsister, Peggy, who we come to love because she is so irascible, dies. She dies. This is a kid's book. Grandmaster of Sci-Fi Samuel Delany, author of Dahlgren, Babel 17, and many other books, recalls that this book and this death scene made him want to become a science fiction writer.
I think the book in the science fiction field that probably had the biggest impact on me when I was a kid was a book called Farmer in the Sky by Robert Heinlein. And it's a book in which the main character tells the story, and he has a pesky younger sister. Well, I also had a pesky younger sister, and so there was something for me to identify with. There's a quake, and something happens, the atmosphere leaks out, and the younger sister dies. Well, there I was at 12 years old, reading this under the covers by flashlight. And I got to this point. The younger sister died. Well, I began to weep copiously. And I just lay there and cried my eyes out. And it was the first time that I knew that any kind of book, and I was fortunate that it happened to be a science fiction book, could actually make you cry. I didn't realize that you could have that kind of emotional response to a book, to just words written on paper. And probably when all is said and done, that had more to do with my wanting to become a writer, and specifically a science fiction writer, than probably any other book, because it was the first book that I had a real strong emotional response to.
Anyway, at the very end, we get a twist when Tom and his friend Hank discover alien runes on Ganymede. This is a great story, and I think it holds up today. I give Farmer in the Sky 4 stars. Next up is Between Planets, published in 1951. This novel feels like another prototype for a story that Heinlein would eventually improve upon. It's about a boy named Don Harvey who is going to school in New Mexico while his scientist parents are on Mars. But he is suddenly called away. A mysterious family friend gives him some MacGuffin, I think it's a ring, to take to his parents on Mars, but government officials seem to be looking for the MacGuffin. His spaceship to Mars gets diverted to Venus because of a rebellion. Don makes friends with a native Venusian on the ship, and there's a war that breaks out between Earth and the Venusian government. This feels like another coming-of-age story, but also a revolt by rebels, which pops up time and time again in Heinlein's works. And of course, the aliens are more than they seem. It's an okay story, though kind of forgettable among the rest of the juveniles. I give it 3 stars. This is followed up with The Rolling Stones, published in 1952, apparently sometimes also called Space Family Stone. This one is about the multi-generational family, mom, dad, teenage daughter, very young son, grandma, and our main characters, the teenage twin boys, Castor and Pollock. The Stones live on the moon, and Grandma Hazel is one of the moon's founders. She is an engineer, and so is her son, Father Stone, who was also the mayor of the moon at some point in the past. The mother is a physician, and the youngest son, Buster, 4 years old, may be a telepath. At least that's what people think because he can beat everyone at chess. The family is slightly eccentric, though everyone is super smart and accomplished. I kept thinking of that eccentric family in the old Frank Capra movie, You Can't Take It With You. Anyway, the twins, the teenage boys, Castor and Pollux, are mechanical geniuses naturally and convince their father to buy a space yacht for the family to travel around the solar system, though mostly we just see their visit to Mars. This is not one of Heinlein's more successful novels, in my opinion. Not enough happens, and the family is a little too good at everything. Yeah, they're a bit of a family of Mary Sues. The story mostly focuses on the twins, the father, and the grandmother. We don't get as much development of the mother, daughter, and youngest son. The most awesome character was Grandma Hazel, and she pops up again in later Heinlein novels, including The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And we do get tribbles. Yes, you heard me right. Tribbles as in Star Trek tribbles. A scoundrel merchant on Mars sells the twins a native Martian that he calls a flat cat, which are basically these purring rugs that can curl up into balls. And they reproduce when you give them too much to eat, and they can take over a ship if they get into the food stores. They were obviously the inspiration for tribbles in Star Trek, and when the Star Trek producers realized that they basically plagiarized Heinlein, they reached out to Heinlein, who only asked for a signed copy of the script rather than money or credit or whatever. I shudder to think what Harlan Ellison would have done if he was in that situation. Anyway, later Heinlein said he regretted giving it away. But the troubles weren't enough to give the Rolling Stones more than 3 stars. In 1953, the prototype Billings-Roman character that started in Space Cadet was developed more in Starman Jones. It's about Max Jones, a teen boy who is a farmer in the Ozarks who runs away from home after his father dies to join a starship crew. Though he wants to become an astrogator like his uncle, he doesn't have the connections. So he teams up with a hobo who is an ex-space marine, and together they bluff their way onto the crew of the Asgard, a passenger starship. There he meets a rich girl named Ellie who helps him rise in the ranks on their way to a faraway colony planet. Oh, we find out Max is a mathematical genius who has a photographic memory and can do astrogation calculations in his head. The Asgard gets lost in space. The captain dies, and eventually the ship has to land on the nearest habitable planet. But twist! The planet has hostile aliens. Once they deal with the aliens, there are a lot of dead crew members, and somehow Max is promoted to captain. One thing I really appreciate is that Max and Ellie do not get together in the end. Heinlein seems to often recognize that teenage crushes rarely lead to lifelong pairings because Ellie and Max eventually go their separate ways. I like the story and give it 3.5 stars. This brings us to 1954 and the publication of The Star Beast, which admittedly was maybe my favorite Heinlein in middle school. It's also one of the lighter stories. Anyway, our hero this time is John Thomas Stewart XI, whose great grandfather was a famous space explorer who brought home a cute little creature from one of his missions as a pet. The cute little thing is called Lummox, who has, through the generations, grown and grown and grown until now it's the size of a small dinosaur. With John Thomas's father passed away, care of Lummox is his responsibility, but it keeps getting into trouble, eating the neighbor's roses, and his mom wants to sell it to a zoo. Lummox, it turns out, is highly intelligent but still doesn't understand humans after all these years and innocently goes on little rampages, getting John Thomas in so much trouble that they end up in court. Enter Betty, John Thomas's girlfriend, who bullies her way into the courthouse to save Lummox. Okay, now that's just half the story. The other half of the story involves a high-ranking official in the Department of Space Affairs named Mr. Kiku, who, by the way, is a black man, which I only say because it was not the usual demographic for a hero in children's literature in the 1950s. Mr. Kiku is dealing with contact with a super powerful alien race called the Hiroshi, who seem intent on destroying the Earth if the Earth doesn't return their princess, but no one knows who this or what this princess is. But twist, the princess is, of course, Lummox. And princess may be a misnomer because the Hiroshi have multiple different genders. Anyway, Lummox, or Princess Lummox, doesn't want to be bothered because she's enjoying her hobby of raising John Thomases. That really got me when I was in middle school. Anyway, as fun as the story is, on rereading it as an adult, the plot feels really uneven, to the point where I felt it got bogged down at times. So I give the Star Beast 3.5 stars. We're now in 1955 with the publication of Tunnel in the Sky, which can be described as Lord of the Flies in space. In fact, it was published right after Lord of the Flies. Earth is dealing with overpopulation, and that's an understandably common issue sci-fi authors explore during this time period. I'm sure they'd be surprised to find out that we're dealing with negative population growth in the 21st century, but back then, the projections made it seem like a very serious, inevitable problem. So, a lot of the motivation for spaceflight and colonization in the Heinlein Juveniles is to escape Earth's overpopulation. So, Rod Walker is training to be a colonist and must take classes which include a survival class on another planet. There's some technology that opens up a wormhole for the students to travel through to another planet to take their survival course. But something goes terribly wrong and they end up stranded on this planet. There is a power struggle among the kids as they form a new society, and they have to deal with an increasingly hostile environment. The multiracial group is made up of boys and girls. Now, I never caught this, but someone pointed it out to me in one of my other Heinlein videos, is that Rod Walker is apparently black. You really have to read between the lines to find that, and the covers almost always show a white protagonist, but there's at least one with Rod Walker as the black teen boy that apparently Heinlein had imagined. Now, unlike Lord of the Flies, that showed how humanity could easily devolve into barbarism, Tunnel in the Sky is the counter-argument that the human spirit can prevail and civilization can win. Anyway, I found this story thoroughly engrossing, and I give it 5 stars. Now we come to 1956 and we get an unusual book called Time for the Stars. It's unusual because it's written in the first person. Most of the other juveniles are third person. It's also unusual because it's the only juvenile that overtly deals and centers on human telepaths. At the time of the story, Earth, due to overpopulation, of course, is searching for planets to colonize outside of its solar system. According to Einsteinian physics, when the ship nears the speed of light, it experiences time dilation. In other words, it would take generations for news of what ships find to get back to Earth. Enter telepathic twins. Tom and Pat Bartlett are identical twins, and they get scooped up into a government research program which is investigating telepathic bonds between twins, so they could put one twin on Earth and the other can be sent on a ship, and the two can instantly communicate back their discoveries rather than waiting the generations for a ship to return because of time dilation and all that. It's really an interesting concept, and I was excited when I first started reading, especially as the relationship between Tom and Pat is rocky. Apparently, for every pair of twins, one is dominant, and our main character, Tom, is not the dominant twin, and he is kind of bullied by his brother, Pat. Both want to go on the ship, but an accident happens that paralyzes Pat, so Tom is the lucky one to go on the spaceship. Oh, there are multiple sets of twins on each ship, so they act as each other's failsafes. So only a few years pass for those aboard the ship, while on Earth, generations come and go, and they find when they reach the speed of light or near the speed of light, the time dilation makes it so the twins can't understand each other unless the Earth side twin takes drugs to slow their thinking down, because the twin on Earth can only communicate one word an hour. They also discover that telepathic twins can create new bonds with new family members, and Tom eventually creates a bond with his niece, and then his grandniece, and then his great-grandniece. As interesting as all this is, not that much actually happens on the voyage. They find one interesting planet that offers some excitement, but that's only one chapter, and it quickly is resolved. And the ending is kind of Deus Ex Machina, though it is kind of foreshadowed. New ships have been built that can travel faster than light, based on technology developed from observing the telepaths. So the entire mission to find new planets was pretty much for nothing. Anyway, Tom eventually comes home, and if you've read Time Enough for Love, you may see what's coming. I saw it coming, and I was really hoping I was wrong, but no, Tom has fallen in love with his grandniece, and they get married. Keep in mind that they're now the same age, and apparently there's no genetic reason they shouldn't be able to procreate. I don't know. It felt like Heinlein's trial balloon into challenging the incest taboo that he would do in later works. For me, Time for the Stars was a super interesting concept, but it kept deflating, and the ending left something to be desired. I give it 3 stars. In 1957, we get the culmination of the Bildungsroman story that started with Space Cadet and was developed further in Starman Jones and reaches its final apex in Citizen of the Galaxy. Our hero is a young boy named Thorby, who is worth so little he is sold for almost nothing on a frontier planet as a slave to a crippled old beggar named Baslam. Thorby doesn't remember his past, but knows he doesn't want to be a slave, and Baslam doesn't want a slave and immediately frees him. But the two eventually enter this father-son or mentor-mentee relationship, and we discover that Baslam is, twist, more than he seems, and he teaches Thorby mathematics, languages, and so on. Also, being a beggar is just a front. Baslam is actually a spy working to stop the slave trade. When he is caught and executed, one of the last things he does is arrange for Thorby to get off the planet, and he ends up with the Free Traders, who are matriarchal clans of space travelers. Eventually he gets passed again to a military Earthship, and we discover Thorby's true identity. He is the heir to a powerful and rich company. But twist, the company is run by his evil uncle who has it in for Thorby, and we find out the company is, twist, involved in the slave trade, which Thorby is dedicated to abolishing. This is a good one. I give it 5 stars. The final Scribner Heinlein Juvenile is Half Spacesuit Will Travel, published in 1958. Yet another one with a title that is a bit meh, which is a shame because it's actually a really good story. My hunch is it's not that well known because of the title. It's also another one of the lighter books. Anyway, our main character this time is Kip Russell, a teen boy who really wants to go to the moon, but his family can't afford it. Working as a soda jerk. Can you get more dated than that for the 1950s? Anyway, he enters a raffle for a flight to the moon, but he only gets second place, and the prize is a beat-up old spacesuit. He fixes up the spacesuit. There's lots of science-y engineering stuff to skim over, by the way, if you're not into it. But while testing it, he gets kidnapped by evil space aliens. Also on board the ship is another kidnap victim, an 11-year-old girl genius named Pee-wee. And Pee-wee is protecting yet another captive, a telepathic alien she calls Mother Thing. Eventually, they escape by the skin of their teeth, and Mother Thing is revealed to be a member of some galactic alien alliance. But twist! Both the evil aliens and the humans are put on trial for whether it is safe for the galaxy for their respective species to develop as a spacefaring force. The evil aliens are a thumbs down, but the humans are maybe. Let's give them a few thousand more years to evolve, and then we can reevaluate. I really had fun with this story and give it 4.5 stars. Okay, those are the end of the Heinlein Scribner juveniles, but there's one more to talk about. Podkayne of Mars, published 5 years after Half Spacesuit. But I still consider it one of the juveniles because it reads like a middle grade or early young adult. Take your pick. It's unique because the main character is female, and it's also written in the first person, which I said before is unusual for Heinlein's juveniles. Actually, was Podkayne in Time for the Stars the only juveniles in first person? Someone can fact check me with that. Anyway, she is also based on the Puddin character Heinlein created for a couple of short stories meant for girls. So, Podkayne is a 15-year-old girl, and her family are Martian settlers. She has one sibling, a brother named Clark, who is a bit of a juvenile delinquent and probably a sociopath. Their adventure starts innocently enough as she and Clark take a luxury space cruise to Earth with their uncle Tom, who's also a senator on Mars. But first they make a stop at Venus, which has turned into this super capitalistic version of Las Vegas. Oh, to reinforce how wacko capitalism has become, there are television ads in taxicabs. How ridiculous is that? Podkayne, Clark, and their uncle are treated like VIPs on Venus, but twist, we find out the uncle is actually on a diplomatic mission to Luna to represent Mars. Clark is then kidnapped. Podkayne tries to rescue him, and then she's kidnapped too. And the true dastardly plot is unveiled. The kidnappers want to blackmail the uncle to vote in a certain way at the lunar conference, or the kids will die. Clark, being a diabolical genius, manages to kill the kidnappers, but oops, forgets to disable a nuclear bomb he had set up as a failsafe. There are two endings, and I believe most published versions now may contain both endings. Heinlein's original version is Podkayne is killed at the end when she tries to rescue a native Venus baby. The publisher didn't like that and made Heinlein change it so she is just injured. Either way, Clark shows emotion for the first time and looks like he's on the road to redemption as a human being. The story probably has more impact with Podkayne dying, which again was Heinlein's original intent. I give Podkayne 5 stars. Okay, now let's rank All the Juveniles from my least favorite to most favorite. Again, this is just my opinion. So, from bottom to top, at number 13 is rocket ship Galileo, which should come as no surprise. Number 12 is Between Planets. Number 11 is The Rolling Stones. Coming in at number 10 is Time for the Stars. And for number 9, we have Space Cadet. Number 8 is Starman Jones. Number 7 is The Starbies. For number 6, we have Red Planet. Number 5 is Farmer in the Sky. And coming in at number 4 is Have Spacesuit Will Travel. So are you ready for the top 3? Number 3 is Tunnel in the Sky. Number 2, and the penultimate Heinlein Juvenile, is Citizen of the Galaxy. And number 1, our top pick for the juveniles, is Podkayne of Mars. Do you agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Okay, this video has gone on long enough. Without further ado, may all the books you read be